Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are working on lab lesson number 8, which is nervous tissue and the bones and muscles of the lower limb. So before we started our recording here, we split into groups to work on finding the locations of the bones in the skeleton. For this week's class, we are focusing primarily on the bones and the muscles of the lower limb. So here's a quick note for you as you study anatomy. Technically in anatomy, this part of you down here, what we might call the shin region, this is the part of you that we actually call the leg in anatomy. So when we talk about moving the leg, what we're technically talking about is this lower half of your limb. This upper portion up here is technically in anatomy speak called your thigh. So keep in mind that the thigh is the upper part of what normal people call your leg, right? And then the leg in anatomy speak is the lower part of the leg. Down here in the lower part of the leg, what two bones do we have down here? I've got a big one and a little one. Which bones live in the leg? Yeah, so the tibia is the big one that lives in the leg. The fibula is the little one. The way I like to remember it is we tell a little fib, right? So the little fibula, and then we've got the big tibia, kind of like a T-bone steak. So tibia, fibula, we can see those. Remember that the tibia is medial and the fibula is lateral. If I go to the back side of my skeleton, the fibula is still lateral, the little one on the outside. The tibia is still medial, the one in the middle. So we've got the fibula, tibia. Who's this big one that lives up here? Who's up here? Should be an easy one for us. This big one up here is the femur. So I can see the femur from the back side here and from the front side over here. The femur is the big bone in your thigh. And remember from our regional terms that this was the femoral region because the femur lives there. Let's mention this guy right here. What's the technical name of the kneecap? I think I've told you before, my 3-year-old knows this one. Yep, so here's the little patella right here. Patella is in front of the femur. It's kind of next to the tibia there. So we've got the femur. We'll go down really fast. These little bones here inside your toes, what's the name of the toe bones? Bones in the toes. It's actually the same as the name of the fingers. Yeah, so the ones specifically in the toes, when you wiggle your toes, what you're wiggling are your phalanges. The ones that you find making up kind of like the arch of your foot, so the long part of your foot, those are going to be our metatarsals. Metatarsals are where the phalanges meet the tarsal bones. So the tarsal bones are things like the calcaneus. We're learning their special names today. Gotta love that, right? So the big one, your heel bone, is called the calcaneus. And we have several others, most of them being short bones. Remember that short bones are kind of like cube-shaped. So my tarsal bones are little cube-shaped bones that are around the back part of my foot. And then the arch of my foot, we've got these big long bones called metatarsals, and then the little phalanges here in front. 2 hip bones that I ask you guys to identify in our picture here, the pubis and the ilium. Do me a favor, there's the pencil right up above my pointer up here. Click on that pencil. I want the ilium circled in blue. I want the pubis circled in green. So let's make the ilium blue and the pubis green. Pubis green. Yeah, I was going to say we're not sharing the love with the pubis when we look from the back side. It's a little harder to see on the back. Yep, so the ilium is the bone that you rest your hands on when you've got your hands on your hips. We talked about this last week. Does anyone happen to remember what's the name of this part here at the top of the ilium? The part that you actually put your hands on. What's this part of the hips called? Yeah, the iliac crest. A crest, remember, is something that sticks out, and it's the part that sticks out at the top of the ilium. So the iliac crest is up there, hands on your hips on the ilium. And the pubis bone is the one that's in the front in the pubic region. So it's a little harder to see from the backside, but the pubis bone is here. The ilium bone is here from the backside. I guess the one other bone that we didn't label, let me erase, is this one here in the middle between my two halves of the ilium. What's this middle one here? One that's at the bottom of the spinal column, below those vertebrae. Yeah, this is the sacrum here in the middle. Perfect. Okay, so we've identified the locations of our bones. When we look at our joints that we find in the lower limb, all of the ones that I have listed here for you are ones that are named based on the bones that are at their location. Almost all of the joints that are in the leg have a bone name to them. Not all of them, but almost all of them. Let me show you the kind of the biggest exception that we're just going to have to memorize. It's actually a regional term for us. So I'm going to circle right here. These joints that I've circled here in red, these are called the coxal joints. So the technical name for your hip joints are the coxal joints. If you remember back from regional terms, we called the hip region the coxal region. So there's no bone names here, except technically, if you remember, we briefly mentioned this thing called os coxae. The coxal joint, that's this right here. So your hip joint, not named based on these basic bone names. But all of these other ones here, we can use their bone names to help us out. So let's start with the femoropatellar joint. Already talked about this one, right? Between the femur and the patella. So when I'm looking for the femoropatellar joint, I've got my femur, I'm going to draw a blue line on it here, and I've got my patella right in front. My femoropatellar joint is going to be the place where the patella is on top of the femur. I do have a couple other joints that are close to the knee as well, though. Trying to think of the easiest way to do this. Go ahead and grab that pencil again. Can you put a mark next to, on my list here, any other joints that are found close to the knee? Can we make a little mark by anything else that's close to the knee? Okay, so a lot of us are honing in on the tibiofemoral joint. Totally correct. Tibiofemoral is the joint between the tibia and the femur. So I can see that one really clearly on the back side. Just made a little circle over there for us. Where the femur is articulating directly with the tibiofemoral joint, that one's definitely up here. The other one that's pretty close to the knee as well is the superior tibiofibular joint. What are the two bones that are articulating at the tibiofibular joint? Which two do I find at this one? Tibiofibular. Yep, the tibia and the fibula. So I'm going to circle that one here on the back side. And yep, somebody else already circled it on the front. Awesome. Yep. So the tibia and the fibula, where they interact with each other. Now notice it's the superior one. It's the higher one. So the superior one up top. We do also have an inferior tibiofibular joint down here on the bottom. So there are two places where the tibia and the fibula interact with each other. The one that's up higher is the superior one. The one that's down lower is the inferior one. So two places where those guys meet, tibia and the fibula. The tibiotarsal joint is a joint that I find down by the ankle. Remember that the tarsal bones are the bones in the ankle. So when I'm looking at my skeleton from the front, see how the tibia has a divot where it's going to interact with those tarsal bones? And yeah, I can see it here in the back. Someone drew a little line for me where the tibia interacts with, technically it's a tarsal bone called the talus. So where the tibia is interacting with those tarsal bones, I call that the tibiotarsal joint. It's a little hard to see on this picture, but the tarso-metatarsal joint is the place where my tarsal bones meet with the metatarsals. So this is where kind of if you feel in your ankle, where you go from having those little cube-shaped bones into the long skinny bones that are the metatarsals, that's the tarso-metatarsal joint. The sacroiliac joint, what are the names of the two bones here? Sacroiliac. Sacroiliac. Yep, ilium and sacrum. Absolutely right. Ilium and sacrum. So I'm gonna pull out the pink here. Where the ilium and the sacrum meet here in the hips. You can see it best in the back, but we can also kind of see it here in the front. The sacroiliac joint, sacrum and the ilium. Fun fact, Dr. Ollis has insane problems with her sacroiliac joints. Like since we went online, I've literally been to the chiropractor once a semester to have him mess with my sacroiliac joint. It just gets really angry at me. So the lower back joint between the ilium and the sacrum, for me, it's always on the left side. My left sacroiliac joint just gets mad at me, and then my muscles all lock up. Some of the muscles that we learned last week and that we're learning this week. So chiropractor saves my life, man. He helps my SI joint. So, oh no, I'm good now. Everybody's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm good now. I already had my back problems this semester. A couple weeks back, I was having my SI joint problems. So I'm hoping that I am done for this semester. We'll see. Yeah, praise God. Literally, it's bad when my SI joint gets mad. Chiropractor fixed Jesse's neck. Yeah, chiropractors. I have a really awesome one who talks me through the anatomy. He's great because he'll have me do movements, and then he goes over to his chart that show all the muscles in the body, and he circles for me all the muscles that are angry, and he tells me why things are happening. I'm like, dude, this is awesome. Like, this is my life. I teach this. So yeah, as Bill says, she'll remember the SI joint now because of poor Dr. Ollis. So that's perfect. Whatever helps, right? So SI joint here. And we've also got on the hips this one in the front. Hopefully we've already learned this from the skeletal system and from learning that we've got fibrocartilage here. But in between the two halves of the pubic bone, we've got the pubic symphysis holding the two halves of the pelvis together. The only other joints that I'll mention here, the two joints that are left are my interphalangeal joints and my intertarsal joints. Inter just means in between. So places where my phalanges meet in the toes, basically your toe knuckles or whatever we call that, right? That's the interphalangeal joints. And the intertarsal joints are just between those tarsal bones of the feet. So inter always means in between. Phalangeal and tarsal gives us an idea of which bones we're in between. That is the extent of what I'm going to do with you guys with joints from this lab packet. If you have specific questions about any of the joints as you're working through, feel free to reach out via email, because I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about neurons, and I want to make sure we especially have enough time to talk about muscles and muscle movements. So let's switch gears to neurons. For our discussion of neurons, we're going to do our first neuron sketch together. So I'm going to draw a neuron and draw neurons. It's not just Dr. Ollis. We're going to draw neurons. We're going to label our structures on the neurons that we draw together, and then we're going to use that to help us as we're working on labeling the models. So if you have a blank of paper, go ahead and pull it out with me. I'm going to teach you how to draw neurons together. First thing we do when we're drawing a neuron is we start with a cell body. Attached to the cell body, we triangle here. This is something, and I'll type these for us soon, but a little triangle on it, that's something called the Axon Hillock. Coming off of that, we've got our big long line that's called the axon. And then we need to put some little lines here at the end. This is at the end axon. We also need to add some little lines up here to my cell body. And while we're at it, we can add a little dark spot here in the middle. Add an eye, right? Not actually an eye, right? It's the nucleus. But got to add an eye here for my neuron. So look at this. This is a neuron that I just drew that I 100% recommend that you guys draw too. Because if you can find stuff on a sketch as bad as this, you can definitely find stuff on the model. So let's start with some labeling. I mentioned this before. Let me put a bracket here. This part that extends, the longest part of a neuron, what's this part called on a neuron? Who can tell me what I call this long extension here? Yeah, this long part here is my axon. The axon is the part of the neuron that takes messages away. When neurons are all about communicating. So when a neuron needs to communicate with a neighbor, it's going to send a message through the axon. The message that it figures out that it's going to send to its neighbor comes from this circle part here on the neuron. What did we say that the big circle part of the neuron was called? Did anyone catch that? We sometimes think about it as the thinking part of the neuron. Yeah, so this is the part of the neuron called the cell body. The cell body. Inside the cell body, we can see here the nucleus is in there. Nucleus. Now the cell body of the neuron, that's this big area here. Coming off of it are all of these little branches. These little branches that we see here are things that are called dendrites. Dendrites. So we'll label a couple of them. Every branch that comes off is called a dendrite. The job of dendrites, these little branches that come off of my neurons, is to collect information. So you'll see some neurons that have a ton of dendrites, way more than I drew here. Dendrites mean that that neuron collects a lot of information. It collects that information, sends it all into the cell body, where the cell body figures out what to do with it. As the cell body is figuring out what to do with it, it's going to ultimately send any message it needs to away in the axon. The place where it decides or it figures out what message needs to be sent is this little triangle region right here. So this triangle region right here, I'll draw an arrow to it, is a special place called the Axon Hillock. The Axon Hillock. In lesson number 10, the word I'm going to use to describe what happens at the Axon Hillock is a process called integration. So integration is when we collect a whole bunch of messages, integrate them together or mix them all together, and decide what to do about it. So this part of my neuron called the Axon Hillock, I like to kind of think about it like the blender. We put all the messages that come from the dendrites into the blender that is the Axon Hillock. And depending on what all those messages to say, when I add them together, that's going to tell me whether or not I send a message down my axon. So the Axon Hillock is really important for something, like I mentioned, called integration. Here's a teaser for us too, as we think ahead to lesson number 10. The Axon Hillock is the location where I have voltage-gated sodium channels. Voltage-gated sodium channels. How do I open up voltage-gated sodium channels? How do those ones open up? Voltage-gated sodium channels. Yeah, it's all about charge. Absolutely. It's all about charge. Hey, the Axon Hillock, let's tie this back to unit number 1. The Axon Hillock, when we talked about that thing in neurons called the threshold. That was the charge that opened up voltage-gated sodium channels. Here's the part of my neuron where I need to hit threshold, or I need to change my charge. Because if I hit threshold right here, my voltage-gated sodium channels that are all along the axon here, those are going to open up as well. And that's going to allow me to send a message out from my neuron here. So I know that's a little bit of a teaser. I'm not going to focus on threshold. We might use that word integration or processing for the Axon Hillock. But as we learn our anatomy here of neurons, it can't hurt for us to learn some of their physiology too, right? So cell body, dendrites that receive information, axon, where information is sent away with the Axon Hillock, or figure out what message we're sending. For my friends who've had a chance to work on this activity, what did we call these parts here? Does anyone happen to know? At the end of my axon, what do I call these end parts here? Yeah, so it's not a trick question. The end of my axon, I call it the Axon Terminal, where we terminate or where we end. So these are my Axon Terminals that I see right here. This is where a neuron would synapse with or would talk to another neuron. So if I send a message, I'm going to send it away right here, Axon Terminal, where I end the message. Yeah, so Jackie's completely right. The other thing that we can call the Axon Terminal is we can call it a synaptic knob. It's the same thing. When we talk about it being called, let me type that here, the synaptic knob, that helps us recognize that we're talking about a synapse. And a synapse is a place where two neurons meet. So the other thing you can call these places right here is the synaptic knob. That's the end of an axon. It's where one neuron synapses with or meets with another neuron. So two words for the same kind of thing there. The question, does the synapse contain synaptic vessels? So it's not quite vessels. The word is vesicles. Let me type it. It's very similar. Yeah. So the synapse is actually a space where the vesicles that lived inside one neuron's axon terminal, they spit them out, what's inside of them, and they go to the other neuron. So we can look in just a moment at that synaptic knob model that shows those vesicles. Vesicles are just little bubbles that are inside my axon terminal here. When I spit out what's inside those bubbles, it goes across this place called a synapse, which is literally an empty space between two cells. But it goes from one cell to the other cell and allows it to send messages. So synaptic vesicles are little bubbles of information that I find inside these axon terminals. I will spit those bubbles out to allow me to talk to my neighbor. Looking at our list here. Okay, so let me draw something that we can't see yet. Along the axon of my neurons, I am typically going to see some little individual cells that wrap around the axon. The cells that wrap around the axon are known as Schwann cells. Schwann cells. When we talk about Schwann cells, their goal or their job is to build something called the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath, let me type those words for us as well. Myelin sheath. What we want to know about myelin is that it's a layer of fat that I wrap around my axons. The goal of myelin is to help a neuron to send a message faster. So think about it kind of like the insulation in the walls of your house that makes sure that the heat stays in, where next week is going to be cold, right? So we want to keep the heat in, keep the cold out. And with the myelin sheath, we want to keep our electrical charge, or our message that we're sending to another neuron. We want to keep that inside the axon so it can get all the way to the end and I can spit that message out. So the myelin sheath is a fatty insulation layer that helps messages to travel faster down the axon, helps them to stay stronger. The myelin sheath is actually made out of these cells called Schwann cells that wrap themselves over and over and over again. They make a big circle around the axon of the neuron. So if we looked at it in a cross section, so if I chopped straight through this part of my axon and I turned it around, what you would see is the axon, the part of the neuron, but then a whole bunch of layers of the Schwann cells plasma membrane wrapping around this axon. So it's completely insulated or completely surrounded by myelin. What questions do we have right now before I pull up one of those neuron models for us to look at together? Yeah, so Jacqueline asked, so the myelin sheath and the Schwann cells are basically the same thing. Yeah, so what you'll see on a neuron and a neuron model, if I'm asking about the myelin sheath, I'll point directly at the myelin fatty layer itself. If I'm asking about a Schwann cell, I would kind of put a box around the entire cell and ask you what it represents. But yes, the myelin sheath is made out of Schwann cells. When the Schwann cells wrap around each other, or wrap around the axon, excuse me, when they wrap around that axon a whole bunch, what they're doing is they're building the myelin sheath. So Nicole asked about red dots. Yeah, so those, Christina's right, those are our mitochondria, absolutely. Let me label one more thing on this picture with you, and then we'll look at that model together. Notice, ooh, that was way too long, whatever. Notice how I've got some spaces on my axon where there's not Schwann cells. We have a name for those spaces. Yep, Jackie got it there in the chat. Nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier are places where there is not a myelin sheath wrapping around my axon. When we talk about the way that neurons work, the fact that we have these nodes of Ranvier, which are the only places on the axon where there's not a myelin sheath, this allows a neuron basically to kind of send its message really quickly by jumping between these places. So the only places that I have any electrical exchange with my environment is these little places right here called the nodes of Ranvier. So for the time being, what I want you to know about nodes of Ranvier is that they're places where there's no myelin sheath, and they're going to allow me to send messages faster. For now, that's all we need to know. We will talk about them more in our lecture lesson number 10. So nodes of Ranvier, the little spaces in between. Let me show you, there's two neuron models that you need to label. I want to show you the neuron model that looks a little bit funky. I want to show you this one. Here's what I want you to think about as you're labeling this neuron. I want you to imagine that it looks like this. I did a little bit of Photoshop here for you. This model that we're looking at, so you can see it now, big picture, right? We'll label on this one, but let me show you. This is showing me part of my neuron that would be connected to this part down here. If we were in lab looking at this model in real life, this is what it looks like in lab, in real life. That's why we have a picture of it looking so funky. But imagine that I took a neuron that extends long like this, and I chopped it right here, and put the rest of it down below. That's what we see in our picture here. So for labeling purposes, do you guys want me to label it on the pretty one, or do you want me to label it on the chopped up one? I'll put that question to the class. Which one do we want to label? Here's number 2. Here's number 1. I have 1 vote for number 1. Label it chopped. Okay. I mean, that's what you're studying from, right? So help me out here. Let's start with, let's do square here. Start with this part of my model. What would I call this part of my model here, this whole region of my model that's inside the red box? That's my cell body, right? That's the thinking part of my neuron. Notice that attached to the cell body, we have that triangle space that we talked about. So right here is that axon hillock that we talked about. We extend down into the axon. So here's where that axon begins. The axon continues though. Let me get better color here. The axon continues down through that model below. I know green is a little hard to see, but my axon starts here and continues through the middle right here. See, this axon is wrapped up in layer upon layer upon layer of fatty stuff. So what do I call this fatty stuff right here that's wrapping around the axon? Does anyone remember what I called that? Yeah, so this is my myelin sheath that's wrapping around. Notice that the myelin sheath is made out of a cell because here's that nucleus. So this whole thing, let's put a box. The whole thing that I'm looking at right here is a Schwann cell. That's a Schwann cell. And here's another neighboring Schwann cell right here. I can tell because I've got these little nuclei in these cells. But when I look specifically at this outer part that's wrapping around my neuron, that's the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath wraps around the axon that's in the middle. The myelin sheath is made by cells called Schwann cells. One thing that we hadn't mentioned when we talked about the neuron before are things called nasal bodies. Nasal bodies are a neuron's special version of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So when you're studying nasal bodies, think about them as the rough endoplasmic reticulum of my neuron. All of these blue spots that you see in the cell body, all of those are called nasal bodies. So the dark spots we see in the nucleus that aren't, or excuse me, that we see in the cell body that aren't the nucleus, all these other polka dots, all of those are nasal bodies. Okay, let's do an application question. Dr. Ollis's favorite. I've got a whole lot of nasal bodies, a whole lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum inside a neuron. What does that tell me about the function of a neuron if it's got a whole lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum? What does it do a lot of? Yeah, so we're nervous, but we're right. The job of the rough ER was to make proteins, and 100% that's correct. Neurons make a lot of proteins. Some of the proteins that they make are cytoskeleton proteins. What was the job of the cytoskeleton? What does the cytoskeleton do? Yeah, the cytoskeleton is like your skeleton, right? So the cytoskeleton gives a cell its shape, and neurons are cells with super funky shapes, right? Here, let's do my down and dirty neuron up here, since this one's all chopped up. If we're going to be shaped like this, if we're going to have parts that stick out from the top, if we're going to have this long axon here, parts that stick out down here, we are definitely going to need a lot of proteins to do that. So some of what these nasal bodies, these rough endoplasmic reticulums do is they build cytoskeleton proteins. Some of what they do is they build neurotransmitters. That's the chemical messages that neurons use to speak to each other. So some of those neurotransmitters are proteins, which is why I need to have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum to make those messages. So the nasal bodies of a neuron are the dark spots inside its cell body that help us to build proteins because they are the rough ER. Somebody had a question. Their hand went back down.
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I had a little quick question about some of the labeling. I'm sorry if you already answered this, but I had a question about what specifically was the nodes of Ranvier, just to be completely sure.
Okay. Yeah, so can someone help me in the chat? Can you describe what the nodes of Ranvier were? Did anyone catch that? I know we said it really fast. What is a node of Ranvier? Do we remember? Yeah, so absolutely right. The nodes of Ranvier are the spaces in between the Schwann cells. It's a little bit hard to see on this picture. I'm going to go ahead and add kind of a red line in the middle. Honestly, it's not easy to see on this model. It's easier on the other neuron model, but it's the space where we go from one Schwann cell to another Schwann cell. There's a little space in between them. Not easy to see on this one, much better on the other model. But the node of Ranvier is the space in between them. And we had a clarifying question that the myelin sheath is the layers that make up the Schwann cell. That's correct. If you look at the lecture lesson number 10 outline, I'm pretty sure there's a picture that shows you how myelination happens, how we get to having this. Think about it kind of like if you went and hugged a flagpole and then you walked in circles around and around and around that flagpole, but every time you walked around it, like you left a layer of your shirt going around it. So we wrap that pole a whole bunch of times in your shirt because you're walking around it in circles. That's the way that it works with a Schwann cell. Instead of leaving its shirt behind, it's leaving its plasma membrane behind. So these are all parts of the plasma membrane of a Schwann cell. It just keeps stretching and stretching and stretching its plasma membrane around that axon. Yeah, so Ariel asked a good question. There's a type of cells in the packet that you need to know that are called oligodendrocytes. So let me type that word for my friends joining us via recording. Oligodendrocytes. So oligodendrocytes, when we're talking about cells that can make a myelin sheath, the main one when we're studying neurons that make myelin sheaths are called Schwann cells. When we're talking about neurons that live in the central nervous system, they use a cell called oligodendrocytes to build their myelin sheaths. Can someone, let's see if anyone knows this. Do we know what is part of the central nervous system? Have we heard that terminology before? The central nervous system. Yeah, so the brain is one part of it, and the other part of it is the spinal cord. Yes, the spinal cord. So in your brain and spinal cord, things work a little bit differently than like in the nerves that you have out in your fingers, for example. In the central nervous system, in your brain and your spinal cord, the neurons that live there, if they have a myelin sheath, that myelin sheath is made by cells called oligodendrocytes. Now, here's the problem, if you will, with oligodendrocytes. Let's draw ourselves an oligodendrocyte here. Here's my oligodendrocyte. Give them a nucleus eye here. Oligodendrocytes tend to kind of stretch themselves a little bit thin. So what I mean by that is they put off an extension here. Here's my extension. I am wrapping it around the axon of one neuron right here. Awesome. But at the same time, I am reaching down and I've got another foot that's wrapping an extension around another axon of a neuron. And at the same time, I'm reaching over here and I'm wrapping around another axon of a neuron. When we talk about the central nervous system, so in the brain and the spinal cord, the way that I build myelin sheaths is one cell called an oligodendrocyte is going to make myelin sheaths around a whole bunch of different neurons. Everywhere else in your body, we do Schwann cells. They pick one little part of one axon and wrap around just that one part. But when we're in the brain and spinal cord, this guy works on all kinds of different axons all at once. Oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells do the same thing, but oligodendrocytes are found in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells are found in, here's the terminology for it here, we call it the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. So that's the nerves in your hands and your feet and your tongue. Anywhere besides in the brain and spinal cord, that's called the peripheral nervous system. Yeah, so to Ariel's question, Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes are found in the central nervous system. But a good connection to make in your mind is that Schwann cells do the same thing as oligodendrocytes. They're doing the same thing together. There is just one structure on this model that we haven't labeled yet. Yeah, so someone's pointing out here, this right here is the nucleus of a Schwann cell. In case we were wondering what this is the nucleus. This whole thing is a Schwann cell. Here's its nucleus. So the living part of a Schwann cell is on the outside. All of its membrane is wrapped around the inside here. Earlier, somebody had asked about these. These are the mitochondria. It takes a lot of energy for us to send messages. So I got mitochondria inside there. But yeah, this is the nucleus of a Schwann cell. One other thing we haven't labeled on this picture are the axon terminals. And here's where you have to get a little bit creative and think a little bit about what happens with neurons. So when we talk about neurons, here I'll go up to my little sketch up here. Remember that we said on our neuron, this was an axon terminal, right? Each of these were axon terminals. What happens at axon terminals is we bump into the dendrites, or the extensions, of another neuron. See how I just drew another terrible neuron up here? Here's the axon terminals of one neuron. They're touching the dendrites of another neuron. Based on that information, can you guys grab the pencil and see if we have any ideas where we see some axon terminals on this picture? Yeah, there we go. So specifically, I'm gonna grab a pencil too. I'm gonna say most specifically, I'm using the black here. See the places I'm circling in black? Where I see one neuron meeting with my other neuron, those are my axon terminals. It's the place where one neuron that we can't see, that's not really in this model, is touching the next neuron. So these are the end of one neuron's axon, some neuron that lives up here, and they're talking to the neuron that we're mostly doing the labeling on. This axon doesn't have terminals. We didn't extend it quite long enough, but here, let me go to my other slide here. If we were, come on, here we go. If we were to go down here and then add little branches at the end, we could add axon terminals if we were at the end of this neuron here. So these would be axon terminals if we ended this axon. Otherwise, the ones that we can for sure see are these little ones that are touching the cell body and the dendrites of our other neuron here. So this is the best place to say that we label those axon terminals right here. What questions do we still have at the moment? Or give me an emoji. How are we feeling right now? Doesn't have to be good. How are we feeling? Jacqueline is weeping. Nice. We got Mushu back. Here's our friendly hedgehog. And of course, I can't give up on my friend the penguin, right? Tyranny screaming. Check out the guided lesson for this one too. I know there are some labeled pictures and Google images as well, just to get some more insight. Let me jump to something that a few of us had asked about before we move into muscles. A few of us had asked about the structural classification of neurons. So we're going to do a little bit of art class here together. Actually, I have a slide of this, so I'll go back. Let me look at my question here. Yeah, so the question in the chat is, so Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes do the same thing, but they're in different locations. Absolutely correct. Yes, that is 100% correct. So memorize those guys together in a group. They're doing the same thing. They're building that myelin sheath. It's just that one of them lives in the brain and the spinal cord. One of them lives in the nerves that you have in your hands and your feet, for example. Absolutely correct. Okay, so let me mention this. Can you guys tell me in the chat what page in your packet are these little pictures on? Page 4. Perfect. Okay, page 4. Up to this point, when we have been drawing neurons and when we've been labeling neurons, we have been drawing and labeling neurons that look like this one right here. For my friends who've worked on this lesson, what is the structural classification of this neuron that I see right here? What do I name it based on its shape? Yeah, so this one over here is called a multipolar neuron. A multipolar neuron. When I'm naming neurons based on their shape, their structural classification, you're looking for how many extensions or how many branches come off of the cell body. So notice that this neuron has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 extensions that come off of this cell body here. Those extensions include my dendrites that we see, and those extensions include that axon that we see going down. This is a multipolar neuron because I have lots, or I have multiple extensions coming off of the cell body. Now, when I look at this neighboring neuron right here, this neuron has one extension coming off of its cell body. What's the structural classification of this neuron with one extension coming off of the cell body? Yeah, one extension is unipolar, like a unicycle with one wheel. So if I have one extension coming off of the cell body, I just have this place right here. What I'll tell you about these neurons is because there's just one extension coming off of them, when I collect a message with these neurons at my dendrite, I actually send that message straight down to my axon terminals. This type of cell doesn't do any processing at all of the information that it receives. It collects that information and it sends it straight away to the next neuron that it's talking to. So this kind of neuron does no integration or no processing. This type of neuron that I see right here, we have the cell body with 1 and 2 extensions coming off of the cell body. What would be the structural classification of this neuron with 2 extensions? Yeah, 2 extensions. We use the beginning part bi. So this is a bipolar neuron. It has 2 groups of extensions. Bipolar neurons, really the only place we're going to see these in the body is when we're talking about the special senses. So things like the process of vision, things like the process of hearing, that's going to be bipolar neurons that help us to do those kinds of things. In general, unipolar neurons are what we call sensory neurons. They collect information but don't process it at all. Multipolar neurons are my processing neurons. So we have a term for them called interneurons. Interneurons because they do integration. The other thing that multipolar neurons do is they can send directions to control things. If I control things, I'm called a motor neuron, a motor neuron. So unipolar neurons, let me add my note here for that. We said that those are sensory neurons. When we talk about multipolar neurons, they're either interneurons or motor neurons. With bipolar neurons, we are what we call special sensory. Special sensory. Meaning we only do special senses, like vision, for example. Yeah, so Miriam asked the question, what exactly does polar mean? Just think about polar as extensions or branches, the number of things that come off of the cell body. So in a unipolar neuron, I have one thing that comes off. In a bipolar neuron, I have two things that come off. And multipolar, I have lots of things that come off. Nicole asked the question if sensory is touch. Yep, that's one kind of sensory information. Other kinds of sensory information are things like temperature or texture, things like stretching, for example. Tierney mentioned things like smelling and hearing. Those are actually special senses. So those would actually use those bipolar neurons. So when we talk about sensory, we're talking general sensory. Temperature, touch, pain, stretching, those kinds of things. That I think we will cover more in depth again in lesson number 10. So more on that to come. Yes, Miriam has a question.
So my question, the polar, I was looking at the structures. So what we mean by polar is here's the cell, and then all the branches around it. That means it's multi-polar. So I'm just confused. So how we know it's multipolar or unipolar or bipolar?
So look at the cell body and see how many lines come off of the cell body. It doesn't have anything to do with the dendrites or the axon terminals. It's all about the cell body. So just look at that cell body. If I only have one area where things come off the cell body, that's a unipolar neuron. If I only have two areas, so see how all of these dendrites, they all come together just to one branch that attaches to the cell body. Then I've got one branch that's leaving. Since I have two branches, one that comes in and one that goes out, that one's called bipolar. And when I look at this one over here, here's my cell body, and I've got one branch, two branches, three. I've got all of these different places where stuff is going into the cell body. Because there's so many places where things go into the cell body, that's why I call it multipolar. So when you're figuring out what kind of polar it is, ignore the dendrites, ignore the axon. We just want to see how many things attach to the cell body. It's all about the cell body.
Oh, okay. That makes more sense to me. Thank you so much.
Okay. Perfect. Good. So here's what I'll mention in closing with our neurons. You've got this picture in your notes. This is showing us a typical reflex arc. We will talk more about reflexes later in the semester when we're talking about the spinal cord. But in a reflex arc, you have three kinds of functional classifications of neurons. Functional classification means I'm sorting a neuron based on what it does. Structural classification is when I'm sorting a neuron based on its shape. Let's start with the shape classifications because we just talked about those. When I look at this neuron right here, this neuron right here has one extension coming off of its cell body. What would be the structural classification of this neuron if it has one extension coming off of its cell body? Yeah, so this is a unipolar neuron. There's one extension coming off of its cell body. You can see that one little line going down. This neuron right here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 extensions. What would be my structural classification if I have 6 extensions coming off my cell body? Yeah, now we are multipolar. And hey, my last one down here is the same deal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extensions coming off of my cell body. This is another multipolar neuron. We've done our structural classifications. That's just based on shape. Perfect. Now we need to do our functional classifications. This is based on the job of a neuron. Now remember on the last slide we said that unipolar neurons are always sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. Because these are the type of neurons that collect information. In this example, we're collecting information from your skin, and we're sending it into the spinal cord. We're not processing it. We have no idea what it says or means. We're just transporting it from the skin to where I can process it. That's the job of a sensory neuron. And again, anytime I have a unipolar neuron, that's a sensory neuron. Then we get into the spinal cord. The spinal cord has multipolar neurons. Multipolar neurons can be 2 different things. They can be integrators or they can be motor neurons. When we're talking about the neuron that lives in the spinal cord, that's doing my processing, I would call this neuron an interneuron. Interneuron. The word interneuron comes from it being an integrating neuron or a processing neuron. The neurons that live here in the spinal cord, they're processing neurons, interneurons. My last neuron here that goes out and talks to muscles or talks to organs or talks to glands, I would call this last neuron, my orange neuron here, this is going to be a motor neuron. A motor neuron. That's the one that makes something happen. So my motor neuron is the last one in the circuit. My processing neuron, my interneuron, is in the spinal cord, and my sensory neuron starts all the way out here in some part of the body collecting information to send it into the spinal cord. How do we feel about structural and functional classifications? What do we think? Okay. Maybe feeling a little better than we did before, hopefully. Any last minute questions before we move on? Yeah, Hannah says it's going to take practice. Unfortunately, yes. Always practice. Okay, well, I want to move us into muscle stuff because there's a lot of muscle stuff this week. What I want to do for muscle stuff is I want us to start with big picture, our big picture goals with muscles. Maybe do a little bit of muscle ID stuff, but we're going to spend a lot of our time doing muscle actions. Help me out in the chat here. What page do we start telling you to predict muscle actions? You're saying page 9? Is that where we start talking about muscle actions? Okay, so here's what I'm going to say for you. This is, so you know how last week we had just a few muscles that we had to know the actions of? So things like the internal intercostals, the external intercostals. We had a small enough number of muscles that you could memorize their actions, and you kind of had to. There wasn't a great way to predict their actions. When we move into the leg and we start learning all the muscles of the leg, there are too many muscles for you to memorize their actions. We need to memorize rules about how muscles work to help us make accurate predictions. So starting on, I guess my chat is saying, starting on page 11, we give you some general rules. So here's our first set of rules that we give you about flexion and extension. We give you some rules about abduction and adduction. I want you to make a note for yourself about this. This is an underline highlight star idea. Do not memorize the actions of muscles. Do not memorize their actions. We need to work on predicting their actions, because on the exam, I may give you a muscle that you've never heard of before, and I'll tell you where it's found, or I'll show you where it's found, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what it does. So with muscle actions, we should not memorize the specific actions of specific muscles. We need to memorize the rules that apply to parts of the body, because then we can make those predictions. So when you're looking on page 11, I want you to pull out a highlighter or pull out a colored pen, and I want you to highlight or circle or something these statements that you see on that page. The first statement that you see on that page is talking about the muscles on the anterior and medial sides of the thighs and the muscles on the posterior side of the thigh. The first movements that we need to know is we need to know whether we are flexing or extending the femur at the coxal joint. Now, the coxal joint is a weird one. Where did we say the coxal joint is? Where's the coxal joint? Yeah, absolutely right. The coxal joint is your hip joint. This is where the femur meets the bones of the pelvis. So let me briefly circle where that coxal joint is. Coxal joint, we can't see it super well on the backside. Coxal joint. Here's something else for us to underline, highlight, star in this statement. Right here, we're talking about the coxal joint. Because in a little bit here, we're going to switch gears and talk about the tibiofemoral joint. We need to make sure we're keeping straight in our mind. I'm talking about who flexes at the hip or who extends at the hip. Because, let me show you why that matters. I'll bounce ahead to that next page. We're now talking about the tibiofemoral joint. The tibiofemoral joint, here's a teaser. It's backwards. It's the opposite. Please make sure with these rules, we're learning the action word, we're learning the location, and we're learning the joint, because that's going to make a difference. In the chat, remind me, where's the tibiofemoral joint? Where's the tibiofemoral joint? Yeah, the tibiofemoral joint is in the knee, right? It's the joint between the femur and the tibia. When we're talking about flexion and extension at the knee joint, essentially the tibiofemoral joint, where my muscles are found is opposite who flexes and extends compared to the hip. So I want to start with the hip one. We will work our way back to this one. Let's start with the hip one. Right here. Coxal joint, hip joint. We want to know who flexes and who extends. Before we dive into specifics here, remind me, when I talk about flexion, does that mean I'm bringing bones closer together or farther apart? What happens when we flex something? Closer together or farther apart? Yeah, absolutely right. This word flexion, technically when we're describing flexion, the way you saw it in your packet last week, was the angle between bones decreases. Basically a fancy way for saying bones move closer together. At the coxal joint, The bones that we're thinking about are the bones of the pelvis, so specifically things like my pubic bone and the femur. We're talking about the distance between the pelvis and the femur, essentially. When I flex the femur, this means I'm pulling the femur closer to the front side of the body. So here, let me turn on my camera briefly. I know it makes my internet not as great. As I brought my friend the skeleton here, let me show him off. All right, here he comes. Here's my friend the skeleton here. Dr. Alice's life, right? She's got skeletons in her bedroom, not in her closet. Let me get his arms out of the way. They don't want to cooperate. Okay, here's my femur. When I flex my femur, it comes closer to the pelvis. And you can do this with your own body. The good news is no one can see, right? So when you flex your femur, it comes up higher. When I extend my femur, it goes down lower. So flexion of the femur is when you're lifting it up. Extension of the femur is when it comes back down. Let's look at our rule here. Now that we know what flexion and extension look like, let's look at our rule here. When I flex the femur, the muscles that are doing that are muscles that live on the front side of the femur, the anterior side, and muscles that live on the medial side, stuff that's in the middle of the leg. So I'm looking here at a picture of our muscle man. I have muscle man at home too, but he's not as helpful as a skeleton. He doesn't move. If I'm looking at a muscle that's on the front side, the stuff that's on the front of your thigh, those are muscles that you could tell me flex the femur. The muscles that live on the front side are going to pull that femur closer to the front side of your body. So this is muscles like this one right here. This one right here is the big one that's parallel to your femur. This one is called Rectus Femoris. Since it lives on the front side of the femur, when it gets smaller, when it contracts, it's going to pull the femur up higher, more toward the front. Or these two muscles that I have right here, these are my vastus muscles. They're on the front side of the thigh. When I contract my vastus muscles, they pull the femur up as well. This one right here is called the sartorius muscle. When I make this muscle smaller, it pulls the whole leg up, or it pulls it forward. So muscles that live on the anterior and medial side of the thigh. If I ask you what these muscles that live here, if I ask you what they do to the femur at the hip joint, you would tell me that they flex it. They pull the femur up higher. If I ask you about muscles that live on the posterior side of the thigh, on the back side of the thigh, when these muscles contract, when they pull on things, they extend the femur. Now, extending the femur, again, I highly recommend you do this to show yourself what it feels like. Extending the femur is when you pull it back down straight. Let's pull out my friend the skeleton again. Bear with me. Okay, here's my flexion. When I pulled my femur up. Extension is when I take it back down, extension. So flexion was all my friends on the top, my friends in the middle. Extension is my friends on the back. When they pull on the femur, they pull it back down. So if you're a muscle that lives back here, or a muscle that lives back here, we're talking about biceps femoris, for example. We're talking about our semitendinosus, for example. If you are a muscle that lives here on the back side, when you contract, you're going to pull that femur back down. So posterior side, you pull the femur backwards. Anterior side, you pull the femur forward. Medial side, you also pull the femur forward. Nicole asked a good question in the chat. Where are the adductor muscles? Can anyone describe for us where the adductors are? Or if you're feeling bold, you can grab a pencil. Does anyone know where the adductors are? Yeah, so the adductors are in the middle. Absolutely. Yep, so they are the inner thigh muscles. We can see the one that you care about is technically adductor magnus. If you're doing a Google search, there's also some other adductors in there as well, adductor longus. But so we're learning the adductor group. It's these guys here in the very middle. So we'll clear it off here. This is the primary adductor muscle that we're learning. I would say less front side, Nicole, more medial. These guys would be considered medial. They're on the medial thigh. Muscle man's a little bit funky. I know it's kind of hard to see from this picture because it's chopped. I actually kind of like to call him yoga in the park guy because he's got one hand up and he's got one leg twisted to the side. This is the inside of his thigh, the inner thigh. This is the front of his thigh. So yoga in the park guy, he's not standing in anatomical position, which makes him a little bit harder to work with than something in anatomical position. But I can see the adductor group really well. That's in the medial part of the thigh. Okay, so for all my flashcard friends, now is a good flashcard time to make a flashcard. Anterior and medial thigh flexes the femur at the hip. The coxal joint is the hip. Posterior thigh extends the femur at the hip. There's our first set of note cards to make here. Second set of note cards is about abduction and adduction. Remember, abduction is what happens to your arms when the aliens abduct you, so they pull away from the middle of the body. Adduction is when we pull them back down. This should be an easy memorize for us. If you're a muscle that lives on the outside of the leg and you contract, you get shorter, you're going to pull the entire thigh, you're going to pull the femur up with you. So abduction, let me add an arrow here. Abduction is when we go up like this. Adduction is when we're pulling things back toward the middle. So abduction, if you live on the outside, so this is going to be things like my gluteus medius muscle that lives up here at the top on the outside. When this muscle contracts, it pulls the whole femur up, abduction. When we talk about adduction, pulling the leg back in, the good news is the adductor muscles, their name tells us that they do that. So if you live in the middle of the thigh, you pull things toward the middle of the thigh. If you live on the outside of the thigh, you're pulling things toward the outside. Abduction and adduction. Your location, inside or outside, helps us know which way you move things. We have learned the two rules for moving the femur at the hip joint. We're now going to switch gears. We are now talking about the tibia, or we're talking about the leg at the tibiofemoral joint. So now we're talking about the knee joint. With us talking about the knee joint now, remember that we flip our locations. If you live on the front side of the thigh, if you live right here, you are extending the tibia. If you live on the back side of the thigh, back here, you are flexing the tibia. Now, I need to turn my camera on, and I need all of you guys to do this with me, because this is important for us to learn what flexion and extension means when we're talking about the knee joint. Here's my knee joint, probably how you're sitting right now, right? Okay, here's my knee joint. When I put my leg up, the angle between the femur and the tibia increases. When the angle between things, or the distance between them, increases, what did we call that? If I increase my distance, what's that called? Yeah, when I increase the distance, so when I pull that tibia up, that's extension. When I pull that tibia back down, things are getting closer together. That's flexion. So again, feel this on yourself and watch it on my skeleton. Extension is when your knee goes forward or when your shin goes forward. Flexion is when it comes back down. So flex is when you pull your knee in, extend when you pull it out. I tell you to do these things on your body, and I promise you I'm 100% not joking, especially since we are trying to stop my video. Oops, whatever. I would tell you to do this if we were together in class, and I'm telling you now because you're alone that you can totally do these movements, and you should do these movements. So extending your tibia is when you pull it up to make your leg straight. Flexing your tibia is when we pull it back down. Let me get the question in the chat, and then I'll get you, Jesse. The question is, a hamstring curl would be flexion of the knee. Yes, that's correct. A hamstring curl is when you're pulling your tibia back down toward the femur. So that would be considered flexion. Yes. There was another question from Ariel. If we give you a picture of the muscles for this type of question, I can't remember for sure. I will look into that. If we don't, we probably should, because it can't hurt just to give you a picture of the muscle man. I feel like we might, but if we don't, I'll see if we can get that changed, where we can just give you a blank muscle man, so you can consider that. Jesse, you had a question.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, so if you're standing up, when you stand up, that would mean that your tibiofemoral joint is extended.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you're standing, we've extended that joint. When you take a step up and you're pulling the tibia backwards to make a step, that would be flexing it.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a good point to think about, right? Because when we talked about flexing the femur, remember that flexing the femur is when we pulled the femur forward. When we flex the tibia, we actually pull it backwards. Okay? And that may have blown your mind or gone completely over your head. As long as you know what flexion and extension looks like, that's all that matters. But if you're thinking about and if you're acting out at home, flexion of the femur is when you pull your femur forward, you pull it closer to your chest. Flexion of the tibia is when I pull it backwards, when I move it toward my femur. If we can memorize what these movements look like, it really helps us with these rules. Just check this out. Flexing my tibia is when I pull my tibia toward the backside of my body. So when I take this and I pull it up, flexion is when I'm pulling it up. The muscles that live on the backside of my femur, these muscles right here, they're going to help me to pull these bones up. They're going to help me to flex the tibia, because when they get smaller, they pull the tibia this direction up here. When I extend the tibia, it moves toward the front side of the body. So when these muscles up here get shorter, they're pulling the tibia toward the front side of the body. So when these ones contract, the tibia goes this way, it goes up, you're extending your leg. When these ones contract, the tibia goes backwards, we are flexing the tibia. I need to know what questions or what thoughts we're having right now. Yeah, so Nicole asked if the biceps femoris muscle is one of the hamstrings. Yes. So when you hear people refer to the hamstrings, that's biceps femoris. That's something called semitendinosus and semimembranosus. Together as a group, we often refer to them as the hamstrings. Yes, good question. me look. Okay, just one more movement rule to mention for us. So I have a question in the chat about the gracilis muscle. Can anyone help us out with gracilis? Does anyone happen to know where gracilis is? It is a little bit hard to see. I wonder if anyone found it. Yeah, it is an inner thigh muscle. Yep. So gracilis muscle, not all the way up there actually. Gracilis muscle, yeah, somebody did it in green and I did it here in black. It's that one right along the inner thigh. It's the longest one along the inner thigh. We can't really see it over here because we're not looking in the right place. But along the inner thigh here, let me check really fast, see if I can find. I meant to pull visible body all the way up and I didn't yet, so it might take me too long to get it all the way up. But yeah, gracilis muscle, this guy right here, this long one here in the very middle of the thigh. Up above it, here's the adductor muscle that we were talking about. This one right here that goes at an angle, this one's called sartorius. This is actually the longest muscle in the body. It goes from the iliac crest all the way down here onto the tibia down here. Looks like we have a question about this one here. Can anyone help me out in the chat? I'll erase it so we can see it better. Does anyone happen to know what this one is right here? Yeah, so we're looking at semi-tendinosis in here. Semimembranosus, as a heads up, is hiding underneath it. So semitendinosis right here, and then semimembranosus would be down below. Here's biceps femoris back here, biceps femoris. These all make up our hamstrings together, these ones back here. I got visible body to load. Let me see if it's not playing nice though. It just made my guy go upside down. Okay, let me show you, share my screen really fast. I am playing around in visible body here, so if you click on the whole skeleton, we're looking at the back side of the leg. Here's that muscle that we just asked about. Let me see if I can get it to, my computer's running slow, I apologize. So here's my muscle semitendinosus. Let's see if I can move him, not really easily. My visible body skills are lacking a little bit, I apologize guys. So here's semitendinosus. Next to it is biceps femoris. Let's do the other leg. So semimembranosus is tiny. Here's that one you can see. Semitendinosus, big one in the thigh. Biceps femoris is next to it. Adductor muscles are in the middle. So I've got one that I can, there's my gracilis, my big long one, gracilis, in a line. And then we saw that adductor muscle up here. Adductor longus, there's adductor magnus, they're all in the middle. And here's the sartorius muscle that goes from the top of the iliac crest down here onto the tibia. We have the big one on the front, oops. Big one on the front is called rectus femoris. It's parallel to the femur. And then we have our two vastus muscles, vastus lateralis, I'm on the lateral side. Vastus medialis, I'm on the middle side, the medial side. All of these are on the front. So all of these muscles, when they move, would pull the femur up toward the front side of the body, or they'd pull the tibia down lower, they pull that toward the front side of the body as well. They would do extension. So it'd be flexion of the femur, extension of the tibia. My friends on the back are all going to do extension of the femur, pull it backwards, and flexion of the tibia, because they're going to pull the tibia up. I think I missed a message in the chat. Let me see. Hannah says visible body is mean to her. Yeah, I'm not great at it yet either. But play around with it. I think that, let me see if I can remember. I'm in the wrong screen. It's like, why won't that do anything? There is a way to make it move. Okay, so I picked vastus medialis. Notice, so let me go back. Let me show you what I did, if I can. Let's exit this. Okay, let's pick rectus femoris, the big one here in the front. When you clicked on rectus femoris, if you click on this thing here that says details, I'm going to click on details for rectus femoris. Inside, now I can see rectus femoris by itself. But here's what's going to be helpful to you. See these two little things that have triangles on them? This shows me what happens when rectus femoris does its job. One of the things it does is it flexes the hip. So let me zoom in. Remember, flexing the hip, which is the coxal joint, when rectus femoris works, it pulls the femur up closer. And notice rectus femoris, the one we're talking about, is working together with sartorius, which is on the front, and it's working together with my adductor muscles that are in the middle of the femur. So this is hip flexion. That's one of the things that rectus femoris does. And go back. The other thing that rectus femoris does is knee extension. Extension is when we bring the tibia back down. So notice that rectus femoris, when it contracts, pulls the tibia forward. Here's rectus femoris that does that. Here's those two vastus muscles that are on the front side of the thigh that help us to do that. So when you are practicing these actions and who does what, you can see that in visible body. Let's go back and remember how we got here. All the way back, I'm on my big muscle man. I pick a muscle, so we'll switch gears, we'll do vastus here. I pick a muscle, vastus medialis. I click on this little details tab right here, and that's going to show me what particular actions that muscle helps with. So in particular, vastus helps me with extension of the tibia. Pretty cool, right? This is the best part, I think, of visible body, is this stuff. So we just got to practice so it's not mean to us, right, on our computers. I'm still not great. I'm still working on it too. But I love the movement animations. See, check this out too. Let's flip around. I'm going to do Gluteus Maximus, everyone's favorite. I'm going to click here on details. Gluteus Maximus helps with 3 different movements. I can see these 3 movements here. So I'm going to start with hip extension. That's when we pull it backwards, right? So check it out. Gluteus Maximus does hip extension. So does all my friends who live on the back. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus. Semimembranosus is the little one hiding underneath. Oops, clicked on the femur. See if I can find it. Right there, semimembranosus. My adductor, who's living here on the back side and the medial side, helping me out with the process of extension. Exit. Now I'm going to go into abduction. Remember abduction, we pull away from the midline. Help me out with abduction. We're doing gluteus maximus right now, but we also have our friend gluteus medius. And if we looked really deep, there's a little tiny one called gluteus minimus as well. So hip abduction, pulling us up and away. And finally, we're not making you guys learn rotation. But if we were to learn rotation, we're pulling, so we're doing lateral rotation. Femur is turning toward the outside. So turning toward the outside, assisting us with that is gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and in that process. So make sure to check out those actions there. About out of time. Help me out in the chat. I can give us a few more minutes here. What would be most helpful for us to do? Go ahead, Jessie.
Oh, well, I had a question about the actions really quick. So if you're standing up and you put your leg, pull your leg behind you, straight out behind you, would that be flexing or extending?
So you're talking about the femur, correct? When we pull the femur
Yes.
backwards?
Yes.
Yes, so when we pull the femur backwards, we are doing the process of extension.
Extension, okay.
It's possible with the hip joint to do something that's called hyperextension. So technically what we might say that we're seeing in this animation here, because we're going behind what anatomical position is, you'd be standing straight up and down if we were in anatomical position. We're going back behind that. Could technically call this hyperextension. But hyperextension and extension, we're going to consider the same in the context of our class. We're going to call them the same. Yeah. Okay, well, here's the last thing that I want to do with you really fast, because these things are coming up again. They're going to be in every packet that we do from here until the midterm. And those are our prediction actions. For my friends who have worked on this packet, which muscle do you want me to do with you? Our options are Gluteus Maximus. Let's see who else we got here. The adductor group, Rectus Femoris. I kind of lean to these guys, Rectus Femoris or semitendinosus. Does anyone care? Nobody cares. Here, let's send the cricket, right? We got the crickets. Okay. Nobody seems to care. Let's do the glutes. Somebody said the glutes, so we'll do the glutes. Okay. Remember with these activities that our goal is, this is just like those other activities that we just did with making predictions about what muscles do. We're making predictions in the context of origins and insertions. We talked about origins and insertions last week. These are the places where a muscle attaches that either do move or don't move. Which of these places, origins or insertions, are the place that moves when a muscle contracts? The place that moves when a muscle contracts. Yeah, the insertion is the place that moves. The origin is the place that does not move. So if I tell you the origin and the insertion of a muscle, you can predict the action of that muscle. So let's do this one together. Remember, we're going to use two different colors. We're going to use blue and green to help us identify bone markings and predict actions. So we're going to start with the origins. That's the non-moving site. When we talk about the gluteus maximus muscle that we find here in the gluteal region, back here, the origins, the non-moving places, are the posterior parts of the ilium, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So I'm going to take my pencil here, and I'm going to draw some places here on the ilium, on the sacrum, on the coccyx. This is about the general location where the gluteus maximus is. So I drew some attachment sites here. My origin in blue. My insertion is something called the gluteal tuberosity of the femur. So this is a bone marking that we're learning, the gluteal tuberosity of the femur. My green pencil here. It's a little hard to see. It's a little bit not clear. So check out visible body. That might give you a little bit more clarity on it. My gluteal tuberosity, back over here for the attachment site for gluteus maximus. Now that I've drawn my origin and insertion, remember we do connect the dots. It's actually up a little higher. Apologies. When I do the process of muscle contraction, my insertion moves closer to my origin. My insertion moves closer to my origin. And this is where, again, you benefit from the fact that you're not with your classmates because your classmates won't see you when you're moving this insertion toward the origin. So when you feel on yourself, the gluteal tuberosity is kind of on the outside of your hip, and it goes toward my the middle of my body here, I'm pulling this bone back toward its attachment site, toward its origin. So my insertion point moves toward my origin point. When this happens, something on the outside moves closer to the inside. I'm pulling my femur toward the midline. My gluteus muscle is going to pull it toward there. Did I get that correct? I'm mixing up a little bit, I think. This is an abductor. That incorrect. I apologize. I did a bad. Let me look up really fast. So we take the gluteal tuberosity, we move it closer to toward this attachment site. I'm going to pull it up and toward that attachment site. That's going to help me move these two bones closer together. Let me do this one here. This one is a little bit more clear. My origin and my insertion, we're doing rectus femoris now. That's the one in the front of the thigh. My origin of rectus femoris is the ilium bone. That's the one that has the iliac crest. So I'm going to put a little dot up here for the ilium bone. And the acetabulum, remember that's the divot inside of there. Here's my attachment site that is up high. That's my origin, my non-moving. My insertion is on the patella. I'm going to color patella green. And it's on the tibial tuberosity, the tibia. That's a big bump on the front of the tibia. Here's my two attachment sites. I'm going to do my connect the dot here. Connect the dots. Now I included for you, because when we look at the skeleton from the front side, it's maybe a little bit hard to tell what's happening. If we were to take these color markings and put them on the side view of a skeleton here, we're talking about an origin that's up here and an insertion that's down here. When I move, let's draw our little muscle on here. When I move this insertion toward this origin, my leg, the place where we're attaching here, is going to move forward. It's going up closer up here. We're talking about what's happening at the knee joint. So I'm going to pull my knee joint forward. That pushes these two bones closer together. When these two bones get pushed closer together, that's an example of decreasing the angle. That's an example of the process of flexion, if we want to put it in our technical terms, right? Decreasing the angle is flexion. Increasing the angle is extension. I know I really rushed through these activities here. I apologize because we went a little bit long on some other stuff. What I want you to do is I want you to try to do a little bit of practice with these things. Maybe more than the specific examples with the muscles. What I think would be helpful for you this week is to touch various bone markings on your body and work on bringing them closer together. So if I am moving this bone marking closer, well, so it's where muscles attach. So if I have a muscle that attaches up here and a muscle that attaches right here, when I pull the bone markings closer together, that moves this whole muscle out, up and out. Or if I have a muscle that attaches to a bone marking here and it attaches to a bone marking here, that's going to move my whole leg inside. Or if I attach to the back side of the tibia and I attach up here, that's going to pull the tibia backwards. Or if I'm attaching here and here, that's going to pull the tibia forwards. Work on practicing how movements feel on you, and then consider this idea of origins and insertions. Origins and insertions, it's just the place that moves versus the place that doesn't move. Use your own body to predict what these movements look like. These are prediction type things. They go hand in hand with what rules we're memorizing. So keep that in mind. I know we're probably got some mind-blown stuff going on right now, but do we have any last-minute particular questions that you'd like to ask before we call it a day? We're either typing or weeping. Yeah, Jessie says she's trying to process. That's better than weeping. So when Gluteus Maximus contracts, and actually I probably should have put a side skeleton on that one too. Gluteus Maximus is a muscle that attaches to the gluteal tuberosity right here, and it attaches to some stuff up here. When I contract this and pull it closer to this, we're actually going to pull it away from the midline. We're actually going to do the process of abduction with it because we're attaching toward the outside of the femur. It pulls the femur toward the outside to pull it up and toward away from the midline of the body. So closer to these bone markings by pulling it out. So it pulls it away from the body's midline. Isabel says her brain hurts. You're not the only one. I don't think I drank enough coffee this morning. Anyone else feel that way? Not enough coffee in the world. So Christina, to the question about the structural classification, I'll pop up the image and I'm gonna put that one to the class. For my friends here in the class, grab that T. Help me out. What are my structural classifications of these neurons here? Can we label them? Yeah, our brains are hurting. Plus it takes a while to type. We're doing good. Perfect. Yep, so remember those polar words just refer to how many different things come off of the cell body. So how many things are attached to the cell body, that helps us to know which polar word we use. Jacqueline, neuron number 2 in the packet is, let me pull up a picture so you can see it. This one right here, that's neuron number 2. Neuron number 2 has a great node of Ranvier, by the way. We couldn't see that very well. Okay, so yeah, so Jacqueline says she's having trouble classifying that one. Here's the cell body. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different extensions coming off of it. So this would be another one that's considered a multipolar neuron. Yes. Yep, I feel you, Ariel. It is a lot of information, for sure. So remember for this week, as we're wrapping up our session here, remember that we do have a visible body assignment this week. And then we also have the regular lab homework assignment. You do not have a lecture assignment that is due this week. Your lecture assignment is going to be due next Friday. That doesn't mean we don't need to work on lecture. It just means that there's a lot of information in lecture that I want to give you some more time to process. So what I think you should focus on today and tomorrow, first we need to do those IDs for bone markings and for muscles for visible body. Let's start with that because that's due Friday. Then we need to work our way through this lab material to practice with that. We're going to cover the beginning of lesson number 9 in our lecture class time tomorrow. So try to start working on that to get you ready for that. Just know that next week we will also be working on that lesson as well. One last question I see in the chat. Nicole asks, where are the superior and medial aspect of the tibia? Those are directional terms. And so it's just kind of a general area. So what do the words superior and medial mean? What does superior? Yeah, top and middle. Exactly. So let me find my skeleton here. Get to a skeleton as quickly as possible. Here we go. Superior and medial. Superior, here's my tibia, right? So superior is top, medial is toward the middle. So we've got a general attachment site about right here. Superior and medial, about right here. What it means if we tell you that it's the superior and medial aspect, it means that there's not a specific marking there, or there's one that we're not making you learn. So it's just kind of a top and middle area of the bone. That's a general attachment site. Okay, so the word aspect is new. Yeah, so aspect just means area. Change that in your mind to area. That would make it a little bit easier. All right, well, I need to peace out for the day. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. I'm going to turn off the recording. I'll stick around for about 2 minutes if you have any last minute questions. Otherwise, I hope to see a lot of you tomorrow when we start lesson number 9 for lecture.